Hi guys. Hi. It's been a while. It's been some time. I think a little bit over a month since I last posted a video, but I have good reason for that. I was on vacation, and two, and maybe even more importantly, at least for me in my video making abilities, I was really distracted at the end of July, or rather the beginning of August. I'm still distracted, but not to the same extent. At this point, it's been a little over a month since the Venezuelan elections. Now, if you aren't aware of this, okay, I was born and raised in Venezuela, in Caracas specifically, but I have spent half of my life living abroad between the US and Europe, and I'm also a Spanish citizen. And even though there's currently a lot of issues with different parts of the world, my focus for the past few weeks has been my birth country. To tell you the truth, it has been a long time since I allowed myself to feel any kind of concern for Venezuela. I have, for a long time in my life, especially since 2014, I've had to sort of experience a bit of or allow myself to have a bit of an emotional divorce from my birth country or my home country. And I have not followed the situation very closely ever since then, 10 years ago. I mean, there were massive protests in 2014, if you're not aware. And I was not there. I was not in Venezuela, but it was my generation of students that were on the streets, risking their lives every day. And because I wasn't there, I felt like an enormous amount of guilt for enjoying anything in life, going out to eat with friends, going to a party or anything. So I really involved myself heavily in the diaspora effort to bring attention to the situation there, and that was 10 years ago. And then the protests died down and nothing came of it. A little over 40 people died directly as a result of the protests, and again, it doesn't seem like anything happened. So things went cold, and the Nicolás Maduro regime and Chavismo unfortunately continued on. And these are the same people that have been in power since I was old enough to remember what is even the president of a country. I was a toddler when Chavismo first came to power. So, no, I did not, in fact, vote for this. My parents didn't either. In fact, I think one of the reasons this person won was because of the massive amount of people that decided to abstain. The abstention rate was about 40% in 1998. And he only won with about 3 million, with about 30% of the population's vote, with about 30% of the population, of the voting population's vote. Regardless, after 2014 and after things went cold, I just couldn't allow myself to be excited again because of how massive of a low that was. And I think for a lot of Venezuelans that was the case. So I couldn't be bothered. I know there's a lot of things going on in 2017, 2018, 2019 with the whole interim president thing with Juan Guaido and Trump. He actually did try to move things along. He put on further sanctions in Venezuela, harsher sanctions in Venezuela, which actually did result in a couple of military uprisings within the country, Venezuela, of course. They didn't go anywhere. Unfortunately, they failed. But the thing is, the sanctions, the pressure on the regime was strong enough to provoke them. The sanctions were eased with the Biden administration, there's a lot to say about the sanctions. A lot of people that don't know enough about the situation usually attribute the sanctions to the economic downturn of the country. That is like such a frivolous and superficial and ignorant take. I cannot take it anymore. I see it everywhere. But maybe I'll explore it a little bit more in an upcoming video, in another video. You know, if you don't know, guys, I did write a book a few years ago about the Venezuelan situation. I never planned in a million years that I would do that, but a very small publishing house, you know, boutique publishing house, did request that I do it, and so I wrote a book called A Cautionary Tale, which will be linked below. And if you're interested in getting a little bit deeper on the topic, you can go ahead, and the link is on my bio and on my description below. It's relatively an easy read. But regardless, after 2014, I just didn't want to expose myself to another massive disappointment. So even though I was peripherally aware of the Guaido situation, the interim president situation, that Trump was sort of helping in his own way, I did not follow things very closely like I'm doing now. And notice that I said the protests, the massive protests, were in 2014, and that was a long time before Trump imposed sanctions in Venezuela. In fact, most Venezuelans I know personally, I know there's been a massive exodus in the last few years, especially after 2017, but most Venezuelans that I know personally left a long time before those sanctions happened. Some of my friends started leaving in the early 2000s as Chavez's government fired their parents from their jobs at PDVSA, the Venezuelan oil industry company, because they wouldn't bend the knee to him. And that was a part of the process which destroyed the oil industry in Venezuela. And to be very, very clear, there were protests before 2014. Lots of them. My parents went to many of them. My childhood was very politicized, very political, because the country was, I don't know, it was very polarized back then. Even though I rarely ever met anyone that supported Chavez. Maybe at that point in time, it had to do more with the fact that I belonged to a certain social group, to a certain societal group in Caracas, that didn't put me really in contact with a lot of people that supported Chavez, even though I have talked to those people in the past. I talked to them like normal human beings, and I just wanted to understand their perspective. I could go on and on about this, because I did make a sort of friendship with someone that was Chavista in 2014 when the protests were happening, because I wanted to understand him. But regardless, I have a feeling that those people now have shifted gears and have gone to the opposition side. And now that I've spent so much time abroad, and now that I spend so much time on Twitter and on social media, that I read the opinions of people on different parts of the political spectrum, both liberal, very liberal, more right-leaning, very right-leaning, different parts of the socioeconomic background. And the people that have arrived from Venezuela in the last few years have come from all kinds of economic backgrounds, and they're all not Chavista followers. It is incredibly rare for me to come across someone that's Chavista as a Venezuelan, which is not the case for me while living in the United States. Coming across people that support Trump or Biden or the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, it is very common for me to come across both sides of the political spectrum constantly. Same thing when I was in Europe, people supporting political parties that were on one side or the other, very common. For me in Venezuela, coming across someone that supported Chavismo, very, Very, very rare. So going back to the PDVSA thing that I said, the oil company and the people being fired from the jobs in the early 2000s, very early on, anyone that worked there in PDVSA had to wear the Chavista colors of the Socialist Party. Red specifically. This mostly started happening after the 2002 coup against Chavez, which, by the way, I've also heard it was a CIA coup, but I have insider knowledge, guys, that it was not a CIA coup. Everyone that says it's CIA, they usually lack any proof, but I have first-hand knowledge of the people that were actually involved. The empresarios, the businessmen, big business, a lot of them had to leave the country really early on. I have family members that left to go to Spain, Australia, the United States, Mexico. Not only family members, just family, friends, etc., that left really early on because they saw the whole thing coming. They saw that they were going to destroy their businesses, and so they moved them abroad. Okay, so it is definitely very tiring for me to see Americans, Europeans, and other commies and lefties around the world opine that Venezuela would be fine if it were not for the U.S. sanctions that started in 2017. Now, let me be clear. I know that there were sanctions that started before 2017, but the harsher sanctions that really did affect the economy started in 2017. And let me tell you something. If they hadn't destroyed the government, meaning the narco regime that is ruling Venezuela right now, if they hadn't destroyed the economy beforehand and made the people completely dependent on them, the sanctions would not have made that big of a difference, because it wasn't about private industry. They destroyed private industry, they destroyed the oil industry, and what is left of it, if they hadn't destroyed the industry in the country, then the sanctions would not have made such an impact on the economy of the country. Okay, so I just hate reading that opinion, because it shows people don't know what they're talking about, and yet they're so willing to argue with Venezuelans themselves as if we just are not, as if we're just NPCs that are just floating around in space until anyone else looks at us. I left before 2017. My parents also left before 2017, and it was a result of a lot of grievances. One of which being my mom almost robbed at the front door of our home. Thank God for our armored vehicle and secured entrance. My dad's Jeep was shot multiple times while he was driving home from the vet. He arrived at home with his Jeep covered in bullet holes. And thankfully, again, the car had been armored. Multiple of their friends kidnapped, some killed. My mom's brother, my uncle, killed while walking his dog. You know how many arrests have been made as a result of those crimes? A grand total of 0. The country became incredibly unsafe after Chavez took office. It wasn't the safest place in the world before, but it just deteriorated really, really rapidly after he took office. And I talk about this more deeply in my book. It's not a topic that I like to go into. It is a very uncomfortable topic. When this started happening, the worst was, I remember specifically one crime that really rocked everyone that I knew. And it was the killing of brothers that were on their way to school, and they were kidnapped for ransom. And the whole story was horrific. And I remember Hugo Chavez Frias making fun of the mother on national television. So there you have it for the type of person that he was. The dire situation of Venezuela, again, is not only an economic issue, but a corruption issue, a security issue, an education issue, many things. There's a film that I watched last night with my husband called Simon. It's on Netflix if anyone wants to check it out. I actually did not find it impactful enough, just because I lived through a lot of these things that were going on. Maybe didn't personally happen to me, but it happened to people I know. My husband, on the other hand, found it very impactful. So I would suggest, if anyone wants to get a glimpse of what it's like, check it out. Again, it's on Netflix. And the one thing in that film that I found very powerful was when the man said that this was not a dictatorship, it was a business. And that really struck a chord with me, because it is true that it is a dictatorship, but it's also a narco regime, meaning these people have a cartel and they are using a whole country as their base of operations. So it is really, really unfortunate how they've managed to just completely sink one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America, one of the most promising nations in Latin America, into complete misery, and now an embarrassment for all of us that are abroad. I have seen the reputation of Venezuelans take a deep dive since I've been studying abroad, etc. When I first left, I would talk to people, and they would usually have good opinions of Venezuelans, because all they had encountered was people doing businesses abroad or studying abroad and going back home. Venezuelans didn't emigrate as much, but now around 8 million of us have left, and it is one of the biggest diasporas in the Western. It is the biggest diaspora in the Western Hemisphere, at least in this century, or at least in modern history. My parents, ever since I remember, had been going out to marches and protests against Chavismo and Chavez. Neither of them voted for this, but they and their family have paid for it. My mom volunteered personally with Maria Corina Machado years ago, who is now the leader of the opposition. My grandfather was a big part of building the country, so seeing it sink to what it is now has been heartbreaking for my family. Thankfully, my grandfather has not seen it happening. He left us in the year 2000. My mom has not seen her mother, my grandmother, in almost 10 years. So, what is happening right now? We have this hope that it will be different. And hope is everything that we have left. When my parents went to a protest, the one I mentioned in 2002, the ones in April of 2002, they were lucky that they were at the back of the protest, because of some gut feeling, my dad pulled my mom and his aunt back even further. Turns out at the very front, there were Chavista thugs opening fire at the opposition, killing around 21 people. The only news network that televised what was going on was RCTV, and as we imagine was a result of that, Chavez pulled their license and they had to shut down a couple of years after that, permanently. But they kept going to protests, sometimes facing tear gas or worse, until one day they decided it was time to leave. They had grown up in a completely different nation. What they described to me, where they grew up, is no longer recognizable to them, not even to me. There was a nation where my dad traveled often by motorcycle, one which they felt very safe, one which they feel was stolen from us, their kids, because we didn't get to experience that. What I have experienced after being abroad of all these years is, as I said, a change in perspective and reputation for us Venezuelans. At first, I had not met anyone with negative experiences. Just praise, saying that Venezuelans are educated and kind. My parents and my grandparents, when traveling, only got respect that came with the passport. Now, my dad is embarrassed to say where he's from. Yes, there are bad people in those millions of Venezuelans that have left as part of the diaspora. And the bad apples are the ones that make the news, the ones that catch people's attentions. I get it. My parents don't think they will ever return to Venezuela if it becomes free from this narco regime, because they think the country has changed, that the people changed. And though I think that is true to an extent, I also choose to look at it from a glass half full sort of perspective. Venezuela has everything to become a wonderful place once again. And people need to be part of that change. Now we are kind of in a standstill. The opposition of Venezuela has proven that they won the elections after a lot of obstacles imposed by the regime, including incapacitating the main leader from running, Maria Corina Machado. The world is watching, but will the world do anything? Is the international community worth anything other than just to say we're disappointed, we condemn, we reject, etc.? Are they worth anything for humanitarian reasons, or are they just there for their own self-interest? I would venture guess their own self-interest. I'm hoping someone has a self-interest that Venezuela does not continue with the diaspora. Again, it is true that there are global interests at play here, and anyone that hates the US will be against any resolution that favors the US. The narco regime imploding and being removed from office, I think, favors the US. And so we have a lot of people siding against the interests of millions of Venezuelan people simply because they think the fall of this regime favors the US. It's a very selfish and self-absorbed position. Russia and China are also other big players, and guess what? They've had their hands in Venezuela for years now. Iran too. And initially covertly and very openly these days. The Venezuelan government also managed to do what Pablo Escobar never could: be one of the biggest drug trafficking rings while simultaneously controlling all the powers of the government. The National Tribunal, high-ranking military officers, the National Assembly, and of course the Consejo Nacional Electoral, which is the National Electoral Council, the body which controls the elections and the results. They are openly, the members of the CNE are flying the banners of Chavismo, and they have been for years. This is unconstitutional, but it doesn't matter. They can do whatever they want with the Constitution these days. After Chavez died, we thought Chavismo wouldn't survive, as it was based around the cult of personality. But after his death, it became a quasi-religious movement, a myth. And after the 28th of July, it became clear the myth of Chavez is finally dying. So, will this regime manage to hold on? They have, so far, dressed themselves up as a democracy, but it's becoming harder and harder to pretend to be a democracy. If they hang on to power, they will have to remove their mask of democracy and show themselves as the criminal dictators they are. Only a few people that have their ideologies aligned with them will continue to pretend they're a democracy. I don't think these guys will negotiate. They know they will never be safe. They are wanted criminals. They have committed crimes against humanity, and even if the international community offers them immunity in exchange for leaving the country, the cost for them to leave is way too high. I don't know what will happen. I really don't know, but I still cling to hope. Chavez's political career started as an unsuccessful coup d'etat, which killed hundreds of people. Somehow the media idolized him as a savior that wanted to change things. Now the whole country reaps the rewards. He was a military man, and the military is one of the first things he safeguarded his regime against. Venezuela used to be a country that welcomed many immigrants, especially European immigrants, in the 60s and 70s, but now it says goodbye to millions. In 1950, the census showed that at least 15% of the population was a first-generation European immigrant. In the coming years, millions more would come. And if Venezuela doesn't rid itself of this evil, it will become like an infection that will spread all across Latin America, and it's already doing that, and probably the US. Not only with the millions of more migrants that will leave and probably cause a crisis, but with the millions stolen from the pockets of the Venezuelan people that will be funneled into campaigns of leftist leaders around the world with similar tendencies, which has already happened, by the way, a network of thugs ready to impose themselves and their ideologies around the world. So let's pray that doesn't happen, and I'll leave it here. I'm thinking of starting a channel in Spanish as well to talk about this situation and who knows what else afterwards. Hopefully, Venezuela will be free, Venezuela libre, and I will be talking about something else. Anyways, cheers, guys, and I'll see you next time.